So, what if the best way to fight evil wasn't with some ancient ritual or a sacred prayer, but with a really good punchline? We're about to dive into a super unique spiritual text that has a surprising idea about what's really wrong with the world and an even more unexpected way to fix it.
Okay, so our guide for this little exploration is just a single chapter from the book How to Repel Evil Spirits, and we're going to be focusing only on chapter 4, which lays out the spiritual message of a guy named Deguchi Onisaburo. So just remember, everything we're about to talk about comes directly from his unique point of view.
Here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll get some context on Deguchi Onisaburo. Then, we'll get into the problem itself, what he calls evil spirits. From there, we'll raise the stakes by looking at the gravest sin, then pivot to the solution, a whole lifestyle change, and we'll wrap it all up with a final twist you won't see coming, the ultimate weapon.
All right, first up, who is this spiritual figure at the heart of the chapter we're looking at? Let's just set the scene a little.
So, the teachings we're about to get into are all credited to Deguchi Onisaburo. He was a really significant and, often pretty controversial figure in Japan's modern spiritual history. So as we go through this, just remember, we are seeing the world completely through his specific and very unique lens.
So now let's get into the main event, the core problem as this text sees it. What in the world is an evil spirit? And maybe even more importantly, where does this author claim we can find them in our day-to-day lives?
Okay, so the definition in the text is pretty wild because it's not about some kind of monster with horns and a pitchfork. It's actually psychological. An evil spirit, it says, is just a person who doesn't think they're an evil spirit. Their number one defining trait is a complete lack of self-reflection. That inability to ever look in the mirror and ask, hey, could I be the problem here?
Okay, so if that's what they are, where do they hang out? Well, the text is super specific about the kinds of places that seem to attract all this negative energy.
According to this source, these spirits are just drawn to places with intense and usually pretty chaotic human energy. You know that feeling when you walk through a crowded downtown street and just feel totally drained afterward? The text claims that's you, literally bumping into these entities. It also points to bars and nightclubs as major hotspots, plus places centered on vice, and also locations tied to deep sorrow, like suicide spots and graveyards.
And to really hammer this point home, the text uses some incredibly intense imagery. It basically says, if someone with real spiritual sight looked at a person smiling at you in a bar, they wouldn't see a charming smile. They'd see a horrifying monster. It's a powerful way of saying that a pleasant, maybe even attractive surface can be hiding a much, much darker spiritual reality.
All right, so we've got the problem, but what are the actual stakes? This is where the text introduces a really different and kind of challenging moral framework. It defines a sin that it considers more serious than anything else.
And here's where that moral code gets really interesting. The text flat out argues that things like theft, robbery, or even murder are not the worst spiritual crimes you can commit. No, the ultimate sin in this worldview is an intellectual one. It's attacking or persecuting what the text calls divine truth, a true teaching or some kind of savior figure.
And the consequences for this are, well, severe. The text says this specific sin weighs more than any other, and anyone who commits it is heading straight for a deep, inescapable hell. So it's not about a physical crime. It's about a spiritual crime against truth itself, which really raises the stakes within this belief system.
So, how does this all lead to a solution? We've seen the problem. We know the stakes are high. If these spirits are attracted to certain kinds of people and places, how does the text say you should actually defend yourself?
The advice here is less about, specific prayers and more about developing a certain kind of personality. First, be genuinely bright. We're not talking about a fake smile, but a real light that comes from your core. Second, stay calm and stable, because the text says huge emotional swings create an opening for these spirits. And third, live with kindness, because the author says gentleness is the polar opposite of what these spirits are all about.
Of course, it's easy to just say, be bright and calm. But what about all those difficult, messy emotions we all deal with? What's the advice for stuff like grumbling all the time, or holding a grudge, or feeling jealous? I love this part. The advice here is so wonderfully counterintuitive. For grumbling, the text suggests it's really just a weird, indirect way of asking for love, so just be more direct about it. For grudges, it reframes them as the result of a very intense, focused love. The solution?
Spread that love around, like a farmer scattering seeds. And for people who tend to cause problems with their words, the advice is simple and practical. Just try to talk less.
So, we've covered the problem, the stakes, and the lifestyle solutions, but this chapter saves its most powerful, and honestly, its most surprising piece of advice for last. It's presented as the ultimate weapon in this whole spiritual battle.
But before the big reveal, the author has a bit of a criticism. It says that people who actively try to fight evil spirits are often just way too serious about it. They get neurotic, they're super intense, and they totally lose their perspective. And ironically, that whole mindset actually makes them less effective.
And this brings us to the final brilliant point. The ultimate weapon isn't a special prayer or a secret ritual, it's this. You need enough humor to make even evil spirits laugh. After all of those serious warnings and heavy ideas, the ultimate conclusion is that a light heart and a really good sense of humor are the strongest repellents you can have.
And that leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to end on, doesn't it? This text, which is all about battling evil spirits, ultimately decides that humor is the best defense. It kind of makes you wonder, in our own lives, when we're up against problems that feel really serious and overwhelming, what kind of power does a good laugh actually hold?